What we've seen since this crisis began is an attempt to use it for the advantage of capital. So quote Rahm Emanuel, who was Barack Obama's chief of staff in 2008, and he said, "You never want a crisis to go to waste." And what I mean by that is to put policies that otherwise weren't politically possible. Now, that sums up the approach of this government and governments right across Europe. So what they've done is use the crisis to push policies which otherwise would never have been remotely feasible in a normal functioning democracy, if you like, whether it be the privatisation of the NHS, which they wouldn't have even had the guts to put to the electorate, whether it be the attacks on welfare with education and so on, the biggest cuts since the 1920s, whether it be the assault on workers' rights, Adrian Beecroft, a multi-millionaire asset stripper and Tory donor, asked to draw up a charter shredding the remaining rights that workers have. I went to Portugal in November. I spoke to economists and business people there who were very sympathetic, driving in a way the austerity agenda in Portugal. And they were very open to me. They said, these are policies we always supported, mass privatisation, attacking workers' rights, slashing taxes on the rich, but they weren't otherwise politically possible. So whilst there is a genuine crisis, it is being used to shift the balance of power even more in favour of capital, of the ruling class, and to attack the interests of working class people, both in Britain and across Europe. For a long time during the boom period, there was this pretense which the mainstream media and senior politicians push, which is we're all middle class now, class no longer exists. And that has totally changed. I mean, if the book that I wrote had come out 4 years ago, it wouldn't have made half the impact. And that's because, firstly, you've got an economic crisis which is affecting people in completely different ways. You know, George Osborne said, we're all in it together, which has moved between the ludicrous and the offensive ever since it was first uttered, because it's boom time for the people at the top. Sunday Times Rich List every year looks at the top 1,000 wealthiest people in Britain. They're well shot up this year, went up by nearly a fifth last year, and it went up by a third, nearly a third in 2010. Biggest jump ever recorded, whilst it's the biggest sustained drop in living standards in Britain since the early 1920s. It becomes impossible not to accept the existence of class, I think, in those situations when, you know, the plight, if you like, the situation facing working class Britain is so much different from those at the top. I do think it's interesting that capitalism has re-emerged in the kind of popular lexicon in a way. The mainstream press talk about it. We've had people like Vince Cable talking about it for the Lib Dems. We've had Ed Miliband talking about capitalism, admittedly trying to talk about new improved versions of capitalism, such as, obviously, in a way that I wouldn't think is possible or a contradiction in terms talking about, you know, responsible capitalism and so on. But the fact is out there is a real big opportunity for the left, and it needs to be exploited. The left's not often very good at that, at finding hooks. So I think the notion of capitalism is definitely there. I do think as well, during the Occupy protests, for example, there was an opinion poll done by ICM for The Guardian, and it showed 37% of people said the protesters were naive, there was no alternative to capitalism. But 51% of those responded said that the protesters were right to call time on a system that put profit before people. So that does show there's something to be tapped into there, the idea that it's not just austerity we're talking about, or a Tory government, or cuts, or whatever, but actually to make the case about capitalism today. The first point I'd make about the crisis of capitalism not automatically translating into an opportunity for the left is there is a lack of a coherent alternative, and that's because the left as a mass political force all but disappeared because of what happened, particularly in the 80s and the early 90s, the rise of the new right, the systematic defeats that the labour movement suffered, and then the ideological triumphalism that followed the end of the Cold War. So even if you abhorred everything Stalinist totalitarianism stood for, there was this idea it was the end of history, that all challenges to capitalism were now null and void. And what we've got because of that, because of a lack of a coherent alternative, what the media and mainstream politicians have been able to do is redirect people's growing anger from the people who caused the crisis to their neighbours down the street, the working poor against the unemployed over benefits, the non-disabled against the disabled, again over benefits, private sector workers against public sector workers over pensions. Now, unless the left actually fleshes out a coherent alternative, not just sloganising, not just saying clamp down the tax avoidance here, build housing over there, but to actually come together with a coherent alternative that can resonate with people's experiences, then my fear is people's anger may grow, but it will be redirected at all the wrong targets. Politicians have often scapegoated immigration for years. Now, there's this idea that immigration pushes down wages. Now, actually, research suggests that isn't actually the case in overall. There is evidence that has a small impact on the poorest, actually, ironically enough, people who were ex-immigrants themselves because they're competing for similar jobs. But you can easily tackle that by introducing a living wage and having strong trade unions to ensure that all workers are employed on the same terms and conditions to avoid a race to the bottom, rather than attacking immigrants in that way. And when we had the oil refinery strikes a few years ago at the Lindsey oil refinery, those were the demands they were pushing for all workers employed on the same terms and conditions. Now, if you go back to the First International, which Marx and Engels obviously were key members of, one of the reasons that was set up was to stop foreign labour being used as scab labour. That needs an international response to stop people being scapegoated. But the point about it is this: from 2004 onwards, the real income of the bottom half stagnated. That was 4 years before Lehman Brothers crashed. And for the bottom third, it actually declined in real terms. That was nothing to do with immigration. It was to do with the absence of strong trade unions, which could actually fight for workers. And it was to do with a neoliberal form of globalisation, the kind of global race to the bottom. But of course, politicians don't want to talk about those issues whatsoever, and it's convenient for them to blame immigration, which has the advantage of appealing to people's prejudices and having the support of the mainstream press. Firstly, with Labour and the position Labour's in at the moment, people who want a genuine alternative to austerity are understandably very frustrated about the failure of the Labour leadership to offer a coherent alternative. But I see that as the legacy of all those defeats. New Labour itself was a product of the defeats that the left suffered in the 1980s and 1990s. It didn't happen in isolation. Across the world, all social democratic parties shifted to the right, ex-communist parties dissolved, African liberation movements like the ANC abandoned old policies like nationalising the mines, for example. That was a global shift that happened at that time. But today, for me, it's about building pressure from below to drag the Labour leadership kicking and screaming if needs be, but to actually create the political space for the policies that I want to see. Now, you've got to start where people are. So, for example, a lot of talk about welfare spending at the moment. It's actually true, it is high, not because of a bunch of lazy scroungers sitting on sofas watching repeats of Jeremy Kyle all day as the mainstream press would have it. It's to do with a triple crisis, which is the housing crisis, the low wages crisis and the jobs crisis. So instead of billions of pounds being wasted on housing benefit lining the pockets of wealthy landlords, we should be using that to build council housing, which create jobs, stimulate the economy, bring down the housing benefit bill, and also bring down the 5 million strong social housing waiting list in this country. Take tax credits. They're a real lifeline, actually, under the current situation for millions of people, but they are a subsidy for low pay. If we had a living wage and strong trade unions to fight for better wages in this country, we wouldn't have to spend billions on tax credits. And of course, the jobs crisis, so the 23 people chasing every vacancy in this country, because the official unemployment figures was bollocks, to be honest, because although it's 2.6 million just over officially, if you include other economically inactive people who aren't included in the official statistics, as well as people forced to do part-time work because they can't get full-time work, there are over 6 million people in this country looking for full-time work. So we need a massive industrial strategy to actually take that on. With the banks, New Labour nationalise the debts and privatise the profits. We need to talk about democratic control, so you don't just have, basically they can carry on as they did before. Tax, we need not only clamp down on tax avoidance. There's a lot of talk about Jimmy Carr. He was accused of moral bankruptcy or whatever by the Prime Minister. So it's the same guy who appointed Sir Philip Green as an advisor to the government after he was responsible. He registered his company under his wife's name in Monaco to avoid paying tax. So up to £25 billion a year. The last government, one of the most popular policies of the last government was the 50p tax. Even a majority of Tory voters back that. And actually I'm working with a new think tank called Class, set up by a number of trade unions like Unite. One policy we put through YouGov was, would you support the 75% tax for those earning over $1 million, as has been introduced in France? Nearly 60% backed that, including more than 4 out of 10 Conservative voters. So I think those are the sorts of policies which I think could actually be really popular. I'll start offering a coherent alternative, but just as importantly, shift the debate, because at the moment it's the right and the capitalist press who are dictating the terms of the debate, and we need to change that if we're going to shift people's consciousness, if you like. I'm very opposed to the idea of a generation war, this idea that the kind of well-off baby boomers bedded down at the expense of the next generation. Generations aren't homogenous. The last generation may have included people in the 80s, for example, who did very well indeed out of Thatcherism, but it also included millions of working class people who lost their jobs, people in mining areas whose communities were utterly destroyed and never recovered, including in the New Labour period. And today, it's true, working class young people, so young working class people are being disproportionately affected because of things, whether it be the abolition of EMA, whether it be the housing crisis, 5 million strong social housing waiting list, private rent soaring, particularly in places like London, because of cuts to things like youth services. But if you're going to Eton, or you're going to St Paul's, or you're going to Harrow, you've never had it so good. I mean, your parents' wealth is booming, you'll get a huge inheritance. If you're relatively well off and affluent, you'll be able to do unpaid internships to get well off paid jobs which are completely denied to other people. And at the same time, we've got over 30% of people who are claiming job seekers allowance at over 40. We've got public sector workers who are having, of all ages, who are having a deficit tax imposed upon them, so-called, which is what really is at the heart of the pensions issue. You've got hundreds of thousands of old people living in fuel poverty. Every year, hundreds actually die because they can't heat their home. So the issue is class. That's what unites. I mean, you can generalise about the ruling class, about the rich, and call them universally privileged, because by definition they are. You can't say that about an entire generation. Within a generation, there are people with completely different competing interests. And for me, that's why it's important that we don't do what the people at the top want us to do, which is divert our anger at the wrong targets. The real targets that we should be aiming for are the people at the top who cause the crisis. Well, my first book, to be honest with you, was just an attempt to shoehorn a debate about class in a mainstream way. I was trying to, literally, in however modest or limited a way, get a debate about class going again. And it was as much about the ruling class as it was about anything else, actually. It was about the ruling class media and ruling class politics and the offensive against the working class in this country over the last 30 years. So for me, because the whole myth, the myth that I wanted to take on in the first book was we're all middle class now and the old working class had disappeared, with the exception of a feckless, problematic rump which had failed to become middle class through its own fault, if you like. And that was important to take on, because if you don't have this idea of a working class, and there's no left without class politics. So that's why I wanted to write that book. The next book I'm going to write, which is about the British establishment or ruling class, or whatever you want to call it. For me, that's part of the same project, if you like. For me, it's the case that I don't think the left often, in terms of its analysis of British society, has managed to do that in a way which leaves a very small left-wing ghetto. And for me, the next book, in the same way, is trying to look at how Britain is structured. It's not going to be a heavy theoretical book, as my first book wasn't, and unashamedly, that's the case. It's just an attempt to get a debate going about who runs Britain, the nature of British capitalism, if you like, but do it in a way which doesn't end up confined in a, unfortunately, as things stand, very small left-wing ghetto.